The morning it happened, nobody was watching closely enough. That was the part Cora could not stop returning to, weeks later, in the way that people return to the moment just before a thing goes wrong, searching for the hinge, the crack, the second where everything was still ordinary. She had been standing at the fence with her coffee going cold in her hand, and her son Pell had been walking toward the tree line the way he did every morning, the way he had done every morning for the 3 weeks since they had come to stay at her father's property. And she had not been worried. She had not been watching. Atlas saw it first. The horse had been standing at the far end of the paddock, unhitched, unbothered, the way he stood most mornings at that hour, when the light was still low and the field was wet with dew and nothing in particular was happening. And then Pell took 3 more steps toward the trees, and something changed in the animal so completely and so suddenly that Cora felt it before she saw it, some shift in the air, some new quality of stillness, and she looked up. Atlas was moving, not in the way horses move when they are startled, not with that high-headed sideways jolt that meant danger from outside, but with something slower and more deliberate, something that looked almost like intention, crossing the field at a diagonal toward Pell, with his head lowered and his steps steady and no sound at all. Pell did not hear him coming. The boy was 7 years old and small for his age, with his grandfather's dark eyes and the habit of walking with both hands in his pockets, as though he were a man of considerable private concerns, and he was almost to the tree line, maybe 6 feet from the shadow where the field ended and the forest began, when Atlas stepped directly in front of him and stopped. Not beside him, in front of him, between him and the trees. Cora set her coffee on the fence post. Pell looked up at the horse. The horse looked at Pell, and then Pell tried to go around him, stepping left the way children do when they expect an obstacle, to simply step aside, and Atlas turned. Not fast, not dramatically, just turned as though he had been expecting exactly that, and blocked the path again. Pell tried the other side. Atlas blocked that too. The boy stood there for a moment, both hands still in his pockets, studying the horse with an expression that was more curious than frustrated, the way he studied most things. Then he looked back at his mother. Cora was already walking toward them. She would tell this story many times in the weeks that followed, and the part she always paused before was this: she had not been afraid, not then, not in the first minute. Atlas was not a young horse, and he was not a violent one. He was 19 years old, a dark bay with a white blaze down the center of his face, and he had been her father's horse for 14 of those years, and she had never once seen him behave in a way she could not explain. That morning was the first time. She reached him and took Pell's shoulder and said something ordinary, something about breakfast, and she led him away from the trees. Atlas stood and watched them go. When they had reached the porch, she looked back. The horse was still standing at the edge of the field, still facing the forest. He had not moved. She told herself it was nothing. Animals had bad mornings. Animals had moods. She had spent enough time around horses to know that their behavior was not always a message, that sometimes a horse simply decided to do an unusual thing for no reason that made sense to the people watching. She told herself that, and she almost believed it. What she did not know, standing on that porch with her son's hand in hers, was that the same thing had happened the morning before, and the morning before that, and that Dex, the ranch hand who came 3 mornings a week, had watched it happen twice and had not said anything because he did not know what to say. What she did not know was that Atlas had been doing this for 3 weeks, since the day they arrived. The property had belonged to her father, Weston Vance, for 22 years. It sat at the edge of the Clearwater Valley in northern Montana, 40 acres of mixed field and timber, close enough to the national forest boundary that the back tree line was not really a boundary at all, but a suggestion, a place where the managed land dissolved into something older and less predictable. Weston had loved that about it. He had said once that a property with a wild edge kept a man honest, kept him aware of how much of what he controlled was only what he controlled for now. He had been the kind of man who said things like that, not to sound wise, but because he meant them. Cora had grown up partly on this land and partly in Billings, where her mother had moved after the divorce, and she had inherited the complicated relationship with her father that children of divorce often carry, the love and the distance, the longing for something that never quite settled into the shape she needed. Weston had tried. He had called on birthdays and driven 9 hours to her college graduation and stood at the back of the church at her wedding, looking like a man who understood he had arrived late to something. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had loved his land more than he had known how to love the people standing on it. She had forgiven him for that, more or less. When he died in February, she had been the only one to come. There was no one else. Her mother had remarried and moved to Oregon, and her father had never found anyone after. And so it was just Cora and Pell driving 11 hours in a rented truck to deal with whatever needed dealing with, and she had not planned to stay. She had planned 2 weeks, maybe 3, to sort through the house and arrange the sale and close up whatever needed closing. That had been 6 weeks ago. She stayed because Pell asked her to. That was the truth of it, though she had dressed it up in other reasons when she told people, practical reasons about the time of year and the market. But the truth was that on the 3rd day, Pell had come to her in the kitchen with both hands in his pockets and said, in the very specific way that 7-year-olds say things they do not fully understand, that he thought they should stay a little longer because Atlas seemed like he needed the company. Cora had looked at her son for a long moment. Then she had called her job and arranged another 3 weeks of remote work, and she had not asked herself too carefully why. The morning after Atlas blocked the path for the first time that Cora witnessed, she watched more carefully. She told herself she was just watching, just paying attention the way responsible parents pay attention, nothing more than that. Pell went out at his usual time, just after 7, with his jacket unzipped the way he always forgot to zip it and his shoes not quite tied. He walked across the field in a straight diagonal toward the trees, not running, not playing, just walking the way he had walked every morning, purposeful and quiet, the way a child walks when he is going somewhere specific. Atlas came across the field and blocked him again. This time, Cora watched the whole thing. She watched Pell try 4 different approaches, each one an attempt to slip past the horse at a different angle, and she watched Atlas respond to each one with that same deliberate, unhurried turning, that same precise placement of his body between the boy and the forest, and she noticed something she had not noticed the day before. The horse was not looking at Pell. He was looking at the trees. His head was low, and his ears were forward, and his eyes were fixed on a specific section of the woodline. Not scanning, not reactive, but focused the way an animal focuses when it has identified something and is monitoring it and has decided that the most important thing right now is to remain between that thing and whatever it is protecting. Cora did not go to them this time. She stood very still at the fence and watched. After several minutes, Pell stopped trying to get past. He stood in front of Atlas with his head tilted back, looking up at the horse's face, and then he did something that made the breath catch in Cora's throat. He reached up and touched the horse's jaw with both hands, gently, the way her father used to do, and said something. She was too far away to hear the words. Atlas turned and looked at him, just looked at him, for a long moment. And then the horse made a sound she had never heard Atlas make, something low and soft that was not quite a whinny and not quite a sigh, but something in between, something that had the quality of communication without being translatable. And then he stood quietly while Pell dropped his hands and walked back toward the house. When Pell reached the porch, Cora asked him what he had said to the horse. Pell thought about it for a second. "I asked him if he remembered Grandpa," he said. Cora did not know what to do with that. She went inside and made breakfast and did not think about it again for the rest of the day. Or rather, she tried not to think about it, which is a different thing entirely. That should have been the end of it. A strange behavior from an old horse. A child in the early stages of processing a loss he was too young to fully understand. Two things happening at the same time that happened to look, from a certain angle, like a single thing with meaning. But it was not the end of it. On the fourth morning, Cora saw something she did not immediately understand. When Atlas moved to block Pell's path, she noticed for the first time the thing tied to the horse's mane. It had been there the whole time, so faded and worn that she had absorbed it as part of the horse without really registering it. But now she saw it, a length of braided red cord, dull and frayed at the ends, tied loosely into the mane, just below the crest of the neck. She recognized it. Her father had always carried red cord. Not rope, not twine, but that specific braided kind that came in small spools from the hardware store, and was good for nothing much except marking things you wanted to remember. He used it the way other people used sticky notes, tying small loops around fence posts or gate latches, or the handles of tools to indicate something, usually something he intended to come back to. She had not seen him put that cord on Atlas. She had not been on the property when her father died. She had gotten the call from the county sheriff's department on a Wednesday afternoon in March, while she was at her desk in Billings, and she had been told that her father had gone out into the back section of his property alone the previous evening, and that he had not come back, and that a neighboring rancher had found him the following morning at the bottom of a ravine in the timber behind the east field, approximately a quarter-mile past the tree line. They had ruled it an accident. Weston Vance, 67 years old, had walked into his own backwoods at dusk, and in the fading light had gone over the edge of a ravine he had walked beside for 2 decades and had not survived the fall. That was what the report said. The cord on Atlas's mane had been there when the neighbor found the horse alone in the field that morning, standing at the edge of the tree line facing the woods. Nobody had paid much attention to it. There was a dead man in a ravine a quarter-mile away, and a cord on a horse's mane was not the kind of detail that demanded immediate examination. Cora stood in the paddock, now with her hand near Atlas's neck, looking at the cord up close for the first time. It was tied the way her father tied things, in a double loop that pulled tight but released easily, the specific knot he had learned as a young man and used for everything, because he said it was the only knot that was honest about its own purposes. Her father had put this cord on Atlas. She was now almost certain of that. And he had done it before he walked into the woods that evening. She thought about that for a long time, standing in the field with the morning getting warmer around her, and Atlas completely still beside her, not asking to be touched, not asking for anything, just standing there with that cord in his mane like a sentence that had been started and not finished. That evening, she called the county sheriff's office. She asked if anyone had gone back to look at the area around the ravine after the initial recovery. The deputy she spoke to was polite but uncertain of the details and suggested she call back the next morning. She called back the next morning and was transferred to the officer who had been on the scene, a man named Garrett Wills, who was also polite and also uncertain, and who said that the investigation had been straightforward and the manner of death had not been in question. She asked him what the ground looked like around the ravine. He paused. Then he said he didn't understand the question. She asked if there had been signs of a camp or markers or anything her father might have brought with him into the woods. There was a longer pause. He said they had recovered a flashlight and a jacket, standard things a man might carry when going out to check on his property in the evening. She asked if there had been anything else, and he said he'd have to check the inventory and call her back and then he did not call her back. That night, Pell came to find her where she was sitting on the porch in the dark. He sat beside her in the other chair and was quiet for a moment, which was his way, and then he said, "I think Atlas wants to show us something." Cora looked at her son. "Why do you think that?" she said. Pell considered it. "Because," he said, "he keeps stopping me, but he keeps looking. Like he wants to go, but he doesn't want me to go. Like he knows I would follow him." Cora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When Grandpa used to go out to the backwoods, did Atlas ever go with him?" Pell looked at her with the particular expression of a child who is deciding how much of what he knows to share. "He used to," he said. "But Grandpa told him to stay one time, and Atlas always listened to Grandpa." She asked him when he had learned that. Pell looked down at his hands. "Grandpa told me," he said, "the morning before he went out." The temperature seemed to drop several degrees in the time it took Cora to understand what her son had just told her. The morning before he went out. Her father had spoken to Pell. Her 7-year-old son had information about the last day of her father's life that had never made it into any conversation, any phone call, any sheriff's report. She turned in her chair and looked directly at him. "Pell," she said, "what did Grandpa tell you that morning?" The boy was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough that the night sounds around them seemed to get louder. "He said he found something," Pell said, "in the backwoods. He said it was important and he was going to take care of it, and then he needed to write it down somewhere safe. He tied the red string on Atlas so he'd remember what he was doing when he came back." Cora felt the cold move up from the ground into her feet. "Did he say what he found?" she said. Pell shook his head. "He said it was grown-up stuff. He said not to worry." She put her son to bed shortly after that. She sat in the kitchen for a long time afterward and did not sleep that night. She made tea she did not drink. She opened her laptop and stared at a blank browser window for several minutes before she closed it again. She thought about calling someone, her mother in Oregon, a friend from work, someone who could sit on the other end of a phone and help her sort through what she was feeling. But she did not call anyone because she could not figure out where to begin, and because what she was feeling was not grief exactly, or not just grief, but something with more angles than grief has. Her father had spoken to her son on the morning of the day he died. He had shared something with a 7-year-old child that he had not shared with her or with anyone else, and she did not know if that was because Pell happened to be the person standing nearest to him that morning, or because children were easier to speak to than the people you had complicated histories with, or because Weston Vance had always found it simpler to let the small and undemanding presences in his life hold the things that mattered most. She thought about what he had said. He found something. He was going to take care of it. He tied the cord on Atlas so he'd remember. He had prepared for a return he never made. She thought about the morning before he died, what the property must have looked like, what he must have felt walking out to that back section of timber alone, carrying whatever he was carrying in terms of what he had found and what it meant. And she understood something about her father she had not understood before. He had not been a reckless man. He had not been a man who took unnecessary risks. If he had gone out in the evening, at dusk, when the light was failing and the terrain was uneven, he had gone because he needed to, because there was something he was tracking, and the timing required it. She sat with that. She also sat with the possibility she did not want to sit with, the one that lived in the pauses of the deputy's answers, in the things he could not confirm, in the inventory he had not sent back. Her father had been a man building a case against someone, and someone had reason to prefer that the case go unbuilt. She did not know. She could not know. Not yet, maybe not ever. But she knew that she was not willing to accept not knowing without making an effort to find out. In the morning, she made 2 calls. The first was to the county sheriff's office again. this time asking specifically for the senior deputy, and the conversation was longer, and she used phrases like potential new information, and I believe there may be something. That was missed, and by the end of it, there was an agreement that someone would come out and look at the property. The second call was to a woman named Britta Sando, who ran search and field operations for a volunteer rescue organization out of Flathead County, and whom Cora had found through an online search the night before, and who listened to the whole story, including the part about the horse, without interrupting, and then said, quietly and without drama, that she thought they should take a walk. They came on a Thursday morning, 4 days after Pell had told her about the last conversation with his grandfather. Britta arrived first, a woman in her mid-50s with short silver-streaked hair and the specific economy of movement that comes from years of working outdoors in situations where wasted motion has consequences. She brought 2 other people from her team, and they stood at the edge of the field with Cora and looked at the tree line and asked measured, practical questions about the direction her father usually walked, the locations he visited regularly, the specific spot where he had been found. Deputy Garrett Wills arrived an hour later. He shook hands with Britta in a way that suggested he knew her by reputation and was not entirely comfortable with her presence, but had been persuaded that her expertise was relevant. Cora brought Atlas out of the paddock. She had not planned this, not exactly. But she had thought about what Pell said, that the horse wanted to go but was waiting. And she had thought about the cord, and she had thought about her father tying it there before he walked into the woods alone. And she had decided to let the animal do what he was going to do and see where it led. She unhooked the lead rope at the edge of the field. Atlas stood still for a moment. Then he walked forward, past the place where he had been stopping Pell every morning for 3 weeks, and into the trees. Britta looked at Cora. Cora looked back at her. They followed. The woods were dense at the perimeter, and then opened up slightly as the land sloped upward. Old timber with high canopy and a forest floor that was soft and quiet underfoot. Atlas moved at a pace that was easy to follow, not fast, not slow, his dark form moving through the filtered light in a way that was almost meditative. And he did not hesitate at the intersections of game trails or at the places where the undergrowth thickened. He seemed to know exactly where he was going. Britta's team spread out slightly to the sides, watching the terrain, noting landmarks. Deputy Wills stayed close to Cora without quite acknowledging that he was staying close to her. They had been walking for approximately 15 minutes when Atlas stopped. He had stopped at the edge of an area that Cora could see had been disturbed. Not recently. The signs of disturbance were old, weathered by months of winter and spring, but they were there if you looked for them. The low vegetation had been cut back in a rough semicircle. There were remnants of what had been a simple camp structure, stakes in the ground, and a length of wire between 2 trees at shoulder height, the kind of thing her father put up when he planned to spend time somewhere and wanted a place to hang his jacket or his lantern. The ravine was 40 feet to the right. Britta was already moving carefully through the disturbed area, looking at the ground, looking at the stakes, looking at the wire. She called something to one of her teammates in a quiet voice, and he came to join her. Cora stood with Atlas and watched. Deputy Wills moved to the ravine edge and looked down and then stepped back and was very still for a moment. Then he said, slowly, he set up a camp here. It was not a question. It was the sound of a man realizing that what he had assumed was wrong. Weston Vance had not walked out to check on his property and accidentally stumbled over a ravine in the dark. He had come to this specific spot on purpose. He had set up a space to work. He had planned to spend time here. Britta came back to where Cora was standing, and she said, in the direct way she said everything, that there were signs of repeated visits, not just one. The vegetation had been managed over time. There were small depressions in the ground that suggested something had been stored here, hovered, weighted down. She wanted to know if Cora's father had any reason to be monitoring this area specifically. Cora thought about what Pell had said. He found something in the backwoods. She asked Britta what kind of thing would require someone to monitor an area of forest over a period of time, secretly, without telling anyone. Britta looked at her, and she looked at the ground. Then she said there were several possibilities, and she wanted to rule them out one at a time. What they found over the next 2 hours changed the way Cora understood the last several months of her father's life. The property line ran through the eastern edge of the back timber, and beyond it, technically on the National Forest boundary, there was a water source, a small seasonal spring that fed down toward the valley. Weston Vance had been monitoring what was happening to that water. He had been doing it carefully, methodically, and alone, because what he had noticed at that spring was not something he was ready to report until he had enough evidence to be taken seriously. Someone had been dumping into it. Not dramatically, not visibly, the way illegal dumping looked in the photographs that appeared in news stories. But consistently, over a period of months, someone had been introducing something into that water source that did not belong there, and the effect was moving downstream in ways that Weston had been tracking through the health of the vegetation and the quality of the runoff into the lower field. He had been building a record, by hand, in a notebook. The notebook was there, in a waterproof case, in one of the depressions in the ground that Britta had identified. It was wrapped in a canvas pouch that Cora recognized as the one her father kept his field tools in. And inside was a notebook he had filled over a period of approximately 4 months with observations. Photographs printed on small sheets, water samples preserved in sealed vials, dates and measurements, and precise descriptions written in his careful, slightly cramped handwriting. He had not finished. He had come out that evening, the last evening, to add something to the record. The camp marker in his mane had been his way of telling himself, and apparently the horse, that there was unfinished business, that he intended to come back. He did not come back. Whether the fall was truly accidental, whether the gathering dark and the rough terrain had simply taken him the way it sometimes takes people who have walked the same ground too many times to fear it anymore, whether there was something more to it, that was a question that the deputy, and eventually the state investigative office would spend the next several months trying to answer. The notebook would be central to that process. The records would be turned over to the Environmental Division of the state agency. The spring would be tested, and the source of the contamination would eventually be traced to a commercial operation 2 miles up the valley that had been operating without proper permits. That part of the story took a long time to finish. But that morning, standing in the October woods with Britta's team moving quietly around her and the deputy speaking into his RDIO and Atlas standing nearby with his head low and his ears forward and that faded red cord still in his mane, Cora understood the shape of what her father had been doing. He had found something worth fighting for. He had fought for it the way he knew how to fight, quietly and carefully and alone, keeping his own counsel the way he always had, not asking for help, because asking for help had never been something he knew how to do. And then something had gone wrong in the dark, and he had not come home, and the work had gone unfinished, and nobody had known, except the horse. Atlas had been with Weston on those walks. Maybe not everyone, but enough to know the direction, enough to know the place, enough to carry in whatever way animals carry things the knowledge of what had been left undone. When Pell arrived at that property, 3 weeks after his grandfather's death, a small boy with his grandfather's eyes and the habit of walking toward the tree line every morning the way children walk toward the things that pull at them without knowing why, Atlas had made a decision. Not a human decision. Not a decision in the way that a person makes a decision, with language and reasoning and deliberate intent, but something, some shift from one state to another, some animal version of, not yet, not him, Not until someone understands? Cora stood in the clearing and let herself feel that for a moment. Thought about her father standing in this same spot, weeks before he died, writing in his notebook in the evening light, careful and methodical and alone, certain that what he was doing mattered, even though no one was watching. She thought about the cord on Atlas's mane, that small specific marker, her father's way of making a note to himself, in the language of the things he trusted, the tools, the land, the animals who had never misunderstood him the way the people in his life sometimes had. She thought about Pell asking the horse if he remembered Grandpa. She thought about the sound Atlas had made in response. There are things a person knows and things a person feels, and sometimes those are the same thing and sometimes they are not. What Cora knew, standing in those woods, was a set of facts. The camp, the notebook, the spring, the months of careful, quiet work. What she felt was something harder to put into words. Something about a man she had not known well enough. Something about the distance that had lived between them for most of her life, and the way that distance was now closing, not because he was here to close it, but because of what he had left behind, what he had been doing in secret, without recognition, for the love of a piece of land and the water running through it and the creatures who depended on both. She thought about something he had said to her years ago when she was still in high school and had come out for one of her summer visits and had followed him on an early morning walk through the back field. He had pointed to a section of timber and said that a piece of land didn't belong to the person who owned it on paper. It belonged to the person who paid attention to it. He had paid attention. Britta came to stand beside her and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, without looking at her, "He knew what he had. Your father." Cora did not answer, because there was nothing to answer. She looked at Atlas, who was still standing in the same place he had stopped, still looking in the direction of the spring, still carrying that cord in his mane. She reached out and untied it. It came loose easily, the way her father's knots always came loose when you knew how to release them. She held it in her hand and looked at it, this small piece of warm red cord that her father had tied to his horse on the last evening of his life, and that the horse had carried for 8 months through everything that followed, through winter and loss, and a spring that came and went, and a daughter arriving, to settle accounts, and a small boy walking toward the trees every morning. She thought about Pell, back at the house, not knowing any of this yet, and also somehow knowing all of it, the way children know things that adults believe are being carefully kept from them. She thought about the first morning, Pell trying every angle around Atlas, patient and unbothered, treating the horse's blockade the way he treated most obstacles, as a puzzle that would eventually explain itself if you gave it time. She thought about her father choosing this particular animal to carry this particular marker. Not a fence post, not a stone, not a note in the house, a living thing. Something that would move and breathe and be present on the property every day, carrying the reminder forward through time. She closed her hand around the cord. The walk back out of the woods took about 20 minutes. Britta and her team and the deputy came behind, talking quietly, making notes, beginning the process of turning what they had found into something official and documented and usable. Cora walked beside Atlas. When they reached the field, Pell was standing at the fence. He was 7 years old and small for his age, and he was standing there with both hands in his pockets, watching them come out of the trees. When he saw his mother, his face opened into something that was not quite relief, but was close to it, the way a child's face opens when something they have been holding finally releases. Cora went to him and held him for a moment. Then he looked past her at Atlas. The horse had stopped at the edge of the field, the same place he had been stopping every morning, the same line he had held for 3 weeks. But this time he did not turn. He stood at the threshold and looked at Pell from across the remaining distance. Pell looked back at him. Something passed between them in that moment that was not language, and was not nothing. Then Atlas walked forward into the field, and the mourning continued. The contamination of the spring was confirmed 6 weeks later by state environmental investigators. The commercial operation responsible, a small-scale mineral extraction company operating under a temporary permit that had quietly expired, was cited and eventually fined, and the remediation work on the water source began the following spring. Weston Vance's notebook was entered into the official record. His name appeared in the investigative report as the individual who first documented the issue, the person whose careful and systematic work over 4 months had made the case possible to prosecute. He did not live to see it. Deputy Garrett Wills would later say, in a conversation with Cora that happened months after everything was concluded, that the original investigation had focused on what they knew rather than what they didn't, which was an honest thing to say, and also a way of saying that they had not looked hard enough. Cora did not blame him. She did not spend much energy on blame. There was too much else to do, too much to understand, too much of her father's life to look at carefully now that she had been given a reason to look. She stayed on the property through the winter. She called her employer and made more permanent arrangements. She enrolled Pell in the school in the nearest town, 22 miles of 2-lane road each way, and she drove him there and back, and found that the drive gave her time to think, which was something she had not had enough of in the previous years. She sorted through her father's house, not with the urgency of someone settling an estate, but with the patience of someone learning a life. She found more than she expected. Records, notes, years of careful attention to the land, documented in his precise handwriting. He had been paying attention for a long time. She had not known. She found, in a drawer in the back bedroom that had always been his study, a small folder of letters. They were addressed to her. There were 7 of them, spanning a period of about 4 years, written and folded and sealed and never sent. She did not know if he had intended to send them eventually, or if the act of writing them had been enough for him. The act of saying the things he could not say across the distance that had grown between them. She read all of them in one sitting. They were not traumatic letters. They did not confess to anything, or ask forgiveness for anything, or explain themselves. They were the letters of a man who had not known how to speak across a distance and had tried, imperfectly, privately, in the way available to him. They talked about the land, about specific things he had noticed and wanted to share, about a hawk pair that nested in the same tree every year, about a spring that had started running clean again after years of not running properly, about the way the light fell across the east field in November, which was different from every other month, and which he had never managed to describe adequately to anyone. He had tried to describe it to her in one of those letters for half a page. She sat with those letters in her lap for a long time and did not try to name what she was feeling. Atlas was given the full run of the paddock and the field and the edge of the woods where he had stood for 3 weeks. He did not pace or seem distressed. He was an old horse, and he seemed, after that October morning, to have completed something that had been waiting to be completed, and he settled into his winter patterns with a quietness that Dex, who had worked on that land for years and knew the horse well, said was different from the quietness he had shown in the months before. Like something got resolved, Dex said once, to no one in particular, and nobody disagreed. Pell visited Atlas every morning, as he always had. He walked to the paddock instead of the tree line now, and he stood at the fence and talked to the horse in the low, thoughtful way he talked to most things, and Atlas would come to him and lower his head and stand. They never found a reason for what Atlas did that morning. But 3 weeks later, when they brought the boy back to the trail for the first time, the horse walked straight to the edge of the woods and stood there, perfectly still, head bowed as if he already knew.